Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes as everyone is joining the room. Thank you so much for being here. We'll begin in just about a minute as folks are filtering in. I realize I should have chosen an excellent song to play as we facilitate the beginning of this. Thanks for joining, everyone. The chat is enabled, so if you wish, you could certainly drop in the chat where you are joining us from. Begin. All right, we'll get started here in just about another minute. Seattle, Madison, Wisconsin, Charlottesville, Virginia, mostly Seattle, joining from a lot of places. It's great to have you all. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I see people, well, people are still coming in actually. We'll give it a few seconds. Palm Springs, California. That sounds like much better weather than where I am right now in Maryland. Okay, thank you, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the impact of the pandemic and the racial reckoning on health outcomes in American democracy. I am Dr. Terry Ann Scott. I'm a former professor of African American and United States history, and now I'm the director of the Institute for Common Power. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about our partnership and about the Institute for Common Power, and then we will have an introduction of our panelists. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. So the Institute for Common Power has partnered with the University of Washington Department of Medicine, and I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. We've done that for a very specific reason. The Institute is an educational arm of Common Power. Common Power is a Seattle-based organization that does work all over the country. And the work that we do is to bring about voting justice. The Institute teaches why that is relevant, why it is necessary, and we talk about some of the attacks that we're seeing right now across the country on truth. This lecture series and so many other things we do is designed to combat that truth and to push people from education to action. And with an understanding that voting determines many things, including healthcare and health outcomes. And so we at the Institute for Common Power are honored to partner with the University of Washington Department of Medicine Diversity Council. The partnership was born from conversations between myself and Sean Greenlee, who is here with us, Program Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Department of Medicine. We all understand that racial disparities in healthcare and health outcomes must be acknowledged and understood to be eliminated. To this end, the University of Washington Department of Medicine is sponsoring a series of history courses, for instance. And you see one of the individuals on your screen is Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of what was in 1926 Negro History Week, that is now Black History Month, chosen in February to honor the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. The University of Washington Department of Medicine and the Institute for Common Power have also created this diversity lecture series. This afternoon or evening, we're coming from across the country in different time zones, depending on where you are. We're very excited to welcome a panel of scholars and medical professionals for our second lecture in the series. The discussion is based tonight in part on a new anthology, Afterlife, a collective history of loss and redemption in pandemic America. Editors and contributors to that volume are here with us today, as well as Dr. David Horn, Associate Chair of the Department of Medicine Diversity Council, and a physician at the University of Washington. Before I introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Yohuru Williams, who will facilitate this conversation tonight, I'd like to pass it to Dr. Barbara Jung, who is the chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of Washington. And she'll give us some opening statements.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. And thank you all for joining from all over the country. It's never been more important to continue to educate ourselves and others. Daily events reinforce that. This is why our partnerships are so important. I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Scott as a partner. I'm thrilled to see this esteemed panel. And I'm thrilled that we're coming together to discuss things and to learn from each other. I believe very strongly that in 2023, post-pandemic, and with many more things to come, this is the way forward. This is the way forward to inclusivity, to learning about each other, to being curious, and to give each other grace, which we realize as practicing physicians, there's much at stake. We need to continue to call out health inequities. We also need to really think about how we approach each other, no matter how we look or where we come from. So with that, I want to pass it back to Dr. Scott, and I am thrilled to hear the panel speak today and learn a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoon. So I have the honor of introducing a friend and colleague, Dr. Yohuru Williams. He's a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He's a renowned scholar who has published 9 books and more and counting, and countless articles. Dr. Williams appears regularly on national news programs as well as the History Channel. He's in several documentaries, including Ken Burns' program on baseball and Stanley Nelson's documentary on the Black Panthers. Dr. Williams is also a mentor to many other scholars and has been very generous in helping me, myself, in my career. My friend and colleague, Dr. Yohuru Williams. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, and thank you for hosting us this evening. We have an exciting program prepared for you, and I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's panelists to you. And they are Dr. Keri Leigh Merritt, my co-author, co-editor for Afterlife. She's an award-winning historian, writer, filmmaker, and activist based in Atlanta, Georgia. We also have Mr. Rueben Moore, who is president and executive officer for Minnesota Community Care, who I've had the distinct pleasure of working with closely here in Minnesota. Professor Robert Tsai, who's professor of law at Boston University School of Law, where he teaches courses in constitutional law, presidential leadership, and individual rights. And finally, Dr. David Horn, associate professor of medicine in the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine, and also associate chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Department of Medicine and adjunct associate professor of global health at the University of Washington. We want to have a conversation tonight among the panelists and also with you in the way that Dr. Yoon framed this in terms of what we can learn from the past 3 years and how this really has been, in many ways, what Keri Leigh, Dr. Merritt and I describe as a stress test for America, not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the racial reckoning and American democratic practice in the crosshairs. And to do that this evening, I want to set our panel up by beginning with some conventional wisdom from James Baldwin, who wrote, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change it." We can look at this in one context in terms of what happened with our political structures post the election of Donald Trump, and the idea that altering the way that people thought about the media and fake news, and altering the way that people thought about the undergirding of our civil theology, which is the foundation for our democracy, had catastrophic impact on American politics over that period. At the same time, there are elements of hope in this, and it's what many of the authors in this volume write about. Robert Tsai, who joins us tonight in the first section of the book on American exceptionalism, colonization, and immigration, writes a phenomenal essay entitled "Somewhere USA," begging the question that in this moment, when so much of what we thought we knew about who we were and where we were going as a nation has been called into question, where exactly are we now, and how do we take action moving forward, not only to shore up our democracy, but to interrogate those elements of our society which are desperately in need of revision, from policing to dealing with the social determinants of health to challenges in the way that we deal with violence in our larger society and culture. In reviewing Afterlife, Sarah Joffrey for the New Republic wrote, "In this moment when plague reality continues to underscore how undercared for we all are, reading Afterlife has been a balm." It's interesting to talk about this with a group of medical professionals in particular, because we're in need of medicine, but it's not medicine in the traditional sense. It is medicine in the traditional sense, and it's also what my good friend Keri Leigh Merritt talks about in her phenomenal essay. It's mental healing, it's mental health. And that's also a part of this reckoning. It's not just about what we experienced, it's how we deal with it long term and how it continues to impact our larger society and culture. We also have to look at this in the context of what came before. And that's important because the title Afterlife is something that we take from the work of Saidiya Hartman, who in her book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey along the Atlantic slave route, talked about afterlife in this way and why history is so important in being kind of the Rosetta Stone to decipher this moment. She wrote, "I wanted to engage the past, knowing that its perils and dangers still threatened, and that even now lives hung in the balance." I would say that this is true in terms of how we talk about the social determinants of health and what COVID-19 exposed about how race and class continue to influence access to healthcare. I would argue that's true in terms of how we talk about the racial reckoning, and it's certainly true in terms of how we talk about American politics. She continues, very important, "Slavery had established a measure of man and a ranking of life and worth that is yet to be undone. If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it's not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago." Part of what we hope to get to in this essay, in this collection of essays with the people that we engage, was to interrogate this and other elements of this moment that expose those deeply entrenched challenges around gender, around racial inequality, and also around the social determinants of health. In fact, Hartman writes about it in this way. She says, "This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment." And she concludes, "I too am the afterlife of slavery." Well, I would suggest to all of you today that we are also now the afterlife of COVID, the afterlife of the long 2020, and we all are left to decipher not only what this moment means, but what it will mean going forward. Having said that, and before I get to the panel, specifically for this audience, we can see the afterlife of COVID and the racial reckoning, specifically in areas that are tied directly to your work at the University of Washington Medical School. We see it in the ways that Dr. Scott and Dr. Yoon talked about it in terms of safe housing, transportation, and safe, stable neighborhoods, which at their core are issues that are paramount to good health. We can talk about this in terms of racism, discrimination, and violence in all forms, including a nation awash in access to firearms and the continuing plague of mass shootings in American society. We can talk about this in terms of education, job opportunities, and income disparities, in terms of access to nutritious foods and physical activity opportunities, polluted air and water, the question of citizenship, immigration, and then finally, and most importantly, as I'm sure my colleagues, Dr. Tsai and Dr. Merritt will talk about tonight, democracy and our democratic Republican institutions literally in the crosshairs. When we look at this in terms of the social determinants of health, it maps directly to what is coming out in the literature, particularly around how this impacts people's access to healthcare, economic stability, safe neighborhoods, education, community safety, and social context. At the same time, we have to ask larger questions about, and this is at the center of the work that Dr. Horn and Mr. Moore do, what does it mean to adopt an approach that privileges the need for culturally appropriate and respectful care, particularly in the aftermath of a global pandemic and a racial reckoning? What does it take for us to see what this moment means beyond the kind of more rudimentary engagement of the problem? I spent a little while in Texas a few weeks ago with educators there, and as you know, this is an important question now as we consider what's happening in Texas, in Florida, where the governor has banned AP history, an AP African American Studies course because of the content. And I am always reminded to remind my L1s at the University of St. Thomas in our introductory law classes that law is a practice. And what I shared with those Texas teachers, and I think it's important for all of us to remember, and I use Sandra Day O'Connor for this purpose so that I can't be accused of being partisan in any way, the practice of democracy is not transferred through the gene pool. It has to be taught and learned anew by each generation of citizens. There's a power in that. In fact, O'Connor went one step further in October of 2018 when she explained, I feel so strongly about this topic because I've seen firsthand how vital it is for all citizens to understand our Constitution and unique system of government and participate actively in their communities, the communities that we want to be safe and healthy communities. It is through the shared understanding of who we are that we can follow the approaches that have served us best over time, working collaboratively together in communities and in government to solve problems, putting country and the common good above party and self-interest, and holding our key government institutions accountable. And as Dr. Merritt will talk about, and as we write about in the book, there is perhaps no place where those deficiencies are most evident than in access to affordable healthcare. This is the cornerstone of so many of these issues. So if we can acknowledge that practice, we then understand the importance of history in this equation and why we felt it was important to engage the scholars that we did in this, because this is a historical problem. We talk about a Black Lives Matter movement, perhaps we'd be better served to talk about Black Lives Matter moments, because I can share with you 1905, the precursor to the NAACP, the Niagara movement, and their list of demands in that moment, which sound, if we just interrogate them for just a second, eerily similar to our contemporary moment. We've got them asking for example, this is 1905, courts. We demand upright judges in courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same efforts at reformation for Black as for white offenders. I'm not reading from Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. I'm reading from the Declaration of the Niagara Movement, 1905. We need orphanages and farm schools for dependent children, juvenile reformatories for delinquents, and the abolition of the dehumanizing convict lease system. So they're not exactly talking about abolish the police, which triggers people, but they're talking about deal with the systems of inequality, racial inequality embedded within those systems, which continue to create or contribute to that calculus that Saidiya Hartman talked about. Secondly, and I don't have a lot of time to deal with this, they talk about public opinion. We note with alarm the evident retrogression in this land of sound public opinion on the subject of manhood rights, Republican government, and human brotherhood. And we pray God that this nation will not degenerate into a mob of boasters and oppressors. I posted that on my Facebook wall on January 6th, because a century ago, they were speaking in a very powerful way to the dangers of not dealing with the afterlife for the very things that we talk about in this book and that the panel will deal with today. And then importantly for this panel, for this group, they talk about health. They frame that appeal for health in terms of the opportunity to live in decent houses and localities and a chance to rear children in physical and moral cleanliness. I conclude with you, at least in this section today, before we get to the panel, by acknowledging the violence in Memphis toward Tyree Nichols and the killing of Tyree Nichols by Memphis police, and the question that's been occasioned by so many people and so many public, but the officers who did it were Black. And so this isn't really a question of race. Like, this is different from 2020. And I share with you the words of James Baldwin from his famous essay, Fifth Avenue Uptown, from July of 1960. And Baldwin is talking about policing, but I want to frame this and why history is so important in this equation. Why Keri Leigh Merritt, Raylan Barnes, and myself felt it was so important to bring together scholars like Robin Kelly and Robert Tsai and Mary Dujak and others to tackle these issues, because history is part of that afterlife. Baldwin writes, similarly, the only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. None of Commissioner Kennedy's policemen, even with the best will in the world, have any way of understanding the lives led about the people they swagger about in twos and threes controlling. Their very presence is an insult, and it would be, even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to children. I put that writing from July 1960 up next to a cartoon from 2014 from Daryl Cagle, showing an officer decked out in the surplus gear from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, offering hearts and candy to children who are deathly afraid of the institution because we haven't dealt with the afterlife of the inequality, which informs that institution in ways that continue to divide us. But I go to the part here that I think is most important, where Baldwin takes on the issue that seems to be before us in our contemporary moment. Rare indeed, he writes, is the Harlem citizen from the most circumspect church member to the most shiftless adolescent who does not have a long tale to tell of police incompetence, injustice, or brutality. I myself have witnessed it and endured it more than once. The businessmen and the racketeers also have a story, and so do the prostitutes. And this is not perhaps the place to discuss Harlem's very complex attitude toward Black policemen. And what Baldwin is getting at here is that these are deeply embedded structural issues, the likes of which Saidiya Hartman are talking about, that make up the crux of the afterlife that we talk about. We can see it in the 1960 study to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. This is the final report of the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. I have to chuckle at that. So violence was an issue in 1960 as well. What did that body determine? What did they write? What was their penultimate conclusion? I think that you will find this disturbing, enlightening, interesting, and it will be the basis from which we will jump off and engage our panelists. They wrote in 1960, our most serious challenges to date have been external, the kind this strong and resourceful country could unite against. While serious external dangers remain, the graver threats today are internal: haphazard urbanization, racial discrimination, disfiguring of the environment, unprecedented interdependence, the dislocation of human identity and motivation created by an affluent society, all resulting in a rising tide of individual and group violence. My friends, what we want to talk about tonight is not solely the practice of medicine and how the racial reckoning and COVID-19 have influenced that. We want to talk about the practice of democracy. And we want to talk about interrupting. We're thinking about ways in the aftermath of this. Now in 2023, 3 years removed from George Floyd, nearly 3 years removed from the murder of George Floyd, but in the aftermath of Tyre Nichols. Looking back at COVID and yet recognizing that now the Biden administration is going to remove the restrictions put in place. Where are we? And do we in some sense need a stress test, as Keri Leigh and I write, not only for the kind of individual pieces of this around policing and healthcare, but around our very democracy. And on that note, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to offer just kind of an introductory comment, either on what I've shared or their own sense of this, and then we will move into a larger discussion about where we are in this moment, what we can do, how we can think differently in the way that Baldwin describes, and how we can develop a broader sense in the way that John Lewis talked about it, that Keri Leigh and I write about in the conclusion of Afterlife, how we can work collectively as he inspiringly offered in his final letter to the American people to redeem the soul of America, as he put it. And I will turn to my co-author, my colleague, Keri Leigh, first to offer her thoughts.
Thank you so much all for being here tonight or this afternoon if you're on the West Coast. So happy to be here. It's such an important topic. And I think, we thought about writing this book really in late 2020 as we were just seeing the numbers of deaths and the loss just tick up every single day. And what is absolutely astounding to me right now is that we're sitting here about to go on the 3rd anniversary of the pandemic. And still there have been days in January of this year that we lost over 1,000 Americans a day, over 1,000. That's just reported, right? Just reported. And we are still in the midst of this crisis, the biggest crisis, the most deaths in our nation's history. And I feel like we're being gaslit by the government. We're being gaslit by the mainstream media that this is not continuing to happen and that we don't have years, if not decades, if not generations of actually dealing with the aftermath.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. Mr. Moore.
And I look at what you've shared, and thank you all for inviting me. And I'm just so humbled by being amongst such a prestigious panel. But the word that jumped out to me was zeitgeist. And I've been playing with this word in many of my arenas. I'm a hospital trustee, a university trustee, and of course I lead healthcare in many respects in Minnesota from a health equity lens. And what it says is that have we seen the convergence of all this history, all these many factors, all these social challenges in the present moment? And the current zeitgeist poses a really huge challenge to the question of what is our democracy and what is a republic? Who gets healthcare and who doesn't get healthcare? How do we have to think about the racialized hegemony system in our society and the class system, colonialism and capitalism, how they all converge on the human body, on the human mind? And introducing this topic, I think, is so relevant as we think about what is the future of America. I was in a recent discussion with a number of universities locally, and we're diversifying in Minnesota. And that diversity is stressing the cultures of our campuses, stressing academia, what is academic freedom, the issues. But that diversity is so beautiful, because I know that in healthcare, when I have a diverse workforce, I can have an improved impact on health outcomes. But it starts somewhere. And how do we welcome and celebrate that as a society in this pressure cooker, in the current zeitgeist that's challenged by so many historical factors and current pressures?
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Dr. Horn.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you all on this panel. And I feel like my presence here as a practicing clinician and someone who worked in the ICU, works in the ICU now, and worked in the ICU during the heights of the pandemic. And, just to deviate a little, my greatest fear is that we won't learn from our lesson, any lessons from the pandemic, or we won't have the courage to turn in and figure out how to do things differently. And as we all know, and as the data continues to support and emerge, the pandemic disproportionately affected our communities of color. There was a time early in the pandemic when patients that were severely ill were put on extracorporeal membranous oxygenation. So a machine that would sort of take over the functions of their lungs for them because they were so sick. And if you looked at the list of patients in the ICU who are there for all reasons, liver disease, pneumonia, what have you, if there was a Hispanic sounding name, now that Hispanic sounding name may belong to someone who is of Latinx background or a Filipino background, it was a guarantee that that person was on ECMO. Our ECMO was completely taken up. The most severe patients with COVID were completely taken up by patients of color. And it's a error in, it's a reflection of the social determinants of health. And it's a reflection of how we message interventions, vaccinations to our communities of color. And it's a reflection of the lack of physicians of color in our workforce who can reach out to those communities.
Such a great point. Thank you, Dr. Horn. Professor Tsai.
Hi, it's great to be with you all tonight. Hope you can hear me. Just a quick shout out to everyone here from Washington State. I grew up just on the other side of Seattle, across the Sound in a very small town. I think the way that I would approach the many important issues that have been put on the table is to say that if we think about America as being a country that has been affected by various patterns of political development, we'll see that America is, and this has already been alluded to before, but I just want to underscore it, of course, a slaveholding country, and then, of course, an empire-building nation, and then finally, of course, a nation of immigrants. And it's a combination of all those, at least those three things, if not more, which means that there are different communities and lives of precarity that flow from each of these three different major patterns of economic and political development, right? Now, I mentioned that I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. In my contribution to the book, I spoke as someone who is part of the immigrant experience, and what it was like growing up as a kid there in a family where we lived, paycheck to paycheck, which is not much different from a lot of people who grew up in working class families. But I think there were some differences being someone who grew up in an immigrant family in a mostly white state in a rural part of the country. So I want to put these three different aspects of America's development on the table for us to all think about. And then I would simply say this, that because of these larger patterns of political and economic development, that what COVID has done is revealed and exacerbated a number of fault lines that were already there. And so I'll just mention a few, and I'm sure others will think of additional fault lines. But one, of course, one fault line is the rural and urban fault line. And people's experiences living in urban areas in COVID, very different than what it's like living in more rural areas. We know where in the cities like Seattle and New York, where the early news, if we can think all the way back, right, how devastating that was, and how slow it was for people in other parts of the country to accept, right, that what was happening and playing out in the news was either real or B, something that would happen to them if they were not living in an urban center. So I think that rural-urban fault line is one that we should think about and perhaps talk about. The other one is, of course, a fault line in terms of ideology. Of course, America is made up of not just different people, but different sets of values. And we see differences between a communitarian ethic and a libertarian one. We see, right, a resurgence of, particularly on the West Coast and other places as well, including rural areas, a very strong revival of an individualistic ethic. Suddenly, very strong, since I talk about a legal theory and I pay attention to populist development of legal ideas, notions of choice, right? The choice to refuse medicine, the right to bodily integrity suddenly has salience in certain quarters. And I think this comes out of this fault line. I'll just mention two others really briefly. One is a difference between maybe technocratic form of governance, one based on expertise, medicine, et cetera. People have been through these kinds of experiences before, versus what we might call a more populist or values-driven form of governance. And I think you see people starting to sort, right, over the last few years along these very different fault lines. And then finally, the thing I would mention for us to think about is that while we all, I think in some ways value, most of us value diversity and difference, what the last few years have pushed us to think hard about is that there might be some tension between demographic difference and diversity and perhaps what we might call material equality, right? That we might at times have to dig a little bit deeper for resources and services and access in ways that go beyond the people who are just serving us. So I'll just put those on the table and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Professor Tsai. Incredible. Let's unpack. Let's start with lives of precarity. I mean, you raised a number of interesting points that certainly this conversation will pivot around. But I'd like to start with that notion of lives of precarity. It was very important in writing this book, Dr. Merritt, for you to, for us to focus on Indigenous people in particular. Why was that so important?
Right, as we all know, people of color in this country, Black, Brown, Indigenous, were the ones who were hit the hardest at first, and really up until just recent months, where, of course, things have now shifted, where you have a lot of white, rural, working class whites, middle class whites who have rejected the scientific information and have not gotten vaccinated, have not protected themselves. Now they're obviously disproportionately being affected. But of course, going into this, what we saw was Black and Brown America just literally being massacred by this virus. And again, these through lines go all the way back to slavery and colonialism, and they go back to the fact that we've never had reparations in this country. We've never had any kind of reparations, either for Native Americans, for Black people in America. And that fact has kept obviously people from getting any kind of health care that they need. You know, I'm in the South. I think I'm the only person on the panel in the South. I'm in the deep South. We still have states that don't have Medicaid expansion, right? We still have states where rural hospitals are closing every few months. If you live in a rural place, you cannot get health care. And so we really are at a crisis situation in this country. And unfortunately, because of those historical wounds that have never been healed, we are going to continue seeing racial disparities, because guess who are working the service industry jobs? Guess who are working those jobs that are taking food to people, that are providing healthcare to people, that are cleaning the places that need to be cleaned? Those are Black and Brown and Indigenous people, because of our long history of racism, white supremacy, slavery, and colonialism.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. Mr. Moore, you obviously are practicing in what was the epicenter of this racial reckoning, Minneapolis, 2020, May of 2020, the murder of George Floyd. And yet I know from your work here that long before that happened, you were championing this idea that in order to really respond to the needs, particularly in a city like Minneapolis with a large immigrant population, of the unique health needs of those communities, you had to understand this idea that wounds produce narratives. So in order to provide high quality health care, you had to understand the experience of those individuals. How did history, specifically engaging with those communities and the places that patients were coming from, how did you approach that in Minneapolis?
You know, one of the things we recognize in our work in federally qualified health centers and we are a product of the civil rights movement, FQHCs. And so whether you're urban or rural, there are FQHCs in our country there to provide primary care services. And this was a part of the movement, the fight for civil rights for all or human rights for all. And our country is still levied with a heavy tax we're paying on how do we do this equitably in terms of healthcare. So when we think about these marginalized communities, when I approached it about 5 years ago after leaving Mayo Clinic, the first initiative I launched was trauma-informed care. And folks said, well, why didn't you do culturally responsive care? Why didn't you do something else? Because at the heart of what we're seeing, if you look at health outcomes, you look at ACEs, there's trauma, this deep trauma that's present in communities. There's a deep distrust for the established healthcare system. There's a deep distrust for the democratic institutions that have historically, taking advantages of these various diverse populations and marginalized communities, whether rural or urban. And so I went into every community in every neighborhood, held focus groups with each of the key partners, assets, public officials, to say, how do we think about what's hurting, right? And how that impacts folks down the stream. How does that impact their ability to access healthcare, their willingness to access healthcare? How does it impact the social determinants of health, the resources they have in order to access healthcare, and the various barriers and instabilities that impact that? And in that work, what I realized that in Minnesota, rich Minnesota, right, with the best healthcare organizations in the world, we had huge and deep gaps. We didn't understand the historical trauma of many Minnesotans who had always been under the kind of, I like the fault line of wealth, the fault line of race, under the fault line, and were subjugated for many years to conditions that produce much poor health outcomes. Next, we realized that these same populations didn't have voice, didn't have in our community. And so how do we capture that voice? And so we did a number of studies and published studies through our organization to really capture that voice. But that was the start, is to think about trauma-informed care, healing-informed practices, and then taking those practices and integrating them in our organization. Folks come to our health centers, they look just as good as Mayo Clinics, health centers, right? Just as good as Park Nicollet, just as good as any other institution in our state, because we recognize that these folks deserve dignity at the highest level in our institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Dr. Horn, you spoke specifically to something I thought that was really powerful and that also amplified what Professor Tsai shared around these fault lines. And that was this notion that there's the fear that you expressed that we won't learn the lessons in this moment. As you listen to Mr. Moore talk, what are the other lessons that you think that we may have missed or that you are most concerned about as we think about evolving healthcare post 2020, not only around the pandemic, but around the other issues that Mr. Moore discussed?
Yeah, what I was struck by Mr. Moore talking about the importance, the centrality of FQHCs and sort of being part of the community. So what was interesting in my division at the county hospital, 2 of our long-term staff, both of whom are Black, had to be let go because they didn't want to be vaccinated. And the reasons around it varied, but there was some distrust. And so if you are only trying to build bridges in times of crises, it's like when Black voters complain, you know, we didn't see anyone from the Democrat Party until it was time for the election. And then there's all these promises, and then we don't see them again. If you're only trying to build bridges during times of crisis, that's not going to work. So that locating within the community in good times and bad times is key to reaching out and establishing ties.
Such a great point. Thank you, Dr. Horn. Professor Tsai, I got to ask you, I mean, it's not often that we get to engage with a legal scholar on the question of ideology, and the way that you framed that was masterful. Do you mind unpacking that a little bit more for the audience in terms of these competing ideologies and how, in a lot of ways, they can help people make a better understand what we're witnessing in terms of the political divide right now in our country?
Sure. Well, I think American law, American politics is filled with competing sets of philosophies and ideas, and you know, some have secular bases and some have religious bases, but there are ways of thinking about, for example, there's a case that gets trotted out, the rising out of Massachusetts from long ago, in which the power, the constitutional authority of the state to order the vaccination of people who did not want to be vaccinated, right, was affirmed. It was approved. And of course, anytime we have an emergency or pandemic of this sort, and healthcare people say we need to do maybe some of that, that case gets trotted out. But we've seen in the last few years quite a lot of desire to revisit that decision, that precedent, and effort to contest it and say that that's no longer good law. And I think that's just one example of how these competing philosophies, a communitarian ethic, one in which we put the whole ahead of individual objections, which is great in emergency, but of course means that you lose a little bit of choice over at times the individualistic ethic that we often see in very strong libertarian visions of how society should run, where people should be able to opt out either for religious reasons or simply because they have a different set of values around nutrition and health, right? That second aspect we see on both the left and the right, right? People who are, as Dr. Moore pointed out, distrustful of establishment medicine. You can find that on, on both sides. So that's, I think that's one way to think about what I'm talking about. It doesn't sort very neatly in terms of party. So sometimes we see in the media, like, we see stuff like, okay, Republicans think one way, Democrats think another way. There's some truth to that. And there was a lot of that sorting when it looked like views about COVID and COVID restrictions started to sort along party lines. And that was a problem because it meant that people were getting into their own bunkers and only believing certain kinds of information, right? But in terms of these broader philosophies, they don't necessarily sort neatly all the time. And if we want to reach people who don't fall into our side of the camp, we have to be aware of these fault lines, is I think what I'm saying. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Tsai. Wonderful. Dr. Merritt, history is a big part of this. And as I listened to Professor Tsai talk, I'm immediately struck by the historical comparison to African Americans in particular. I think about the piece by Tara Hunter in our volume on the new Negro servants disease and how Black and brown people, Black people in particular, were singled out at the turn of the century around interventions. We can think about forced sterilization and how that impacted communities of color, specifically African Americans. And then I think about something like the Tuskegee experiment and the long memory, the kind of afterlife of that type of experimentation on African Americans, where they have no choice in the way that Professor Tsai is describing, documented in books like Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid. But you talk about another kind of death in this book, which I think is fascinating, and how this plays out with communities of color, and that's deaths of despair. Can you unpack that a little bit for the audience and talk about why that was so important and why that needs to be a part of this conversation as well?
Sure. So even before the pandemic, obviously deaths of despair, which include suicides, but also deaths from alcoholism, deaths from drug overdoses, whether accidental or on purpose, these were exploding anyway. You know, people were dying earlier and earlier than each successive year. And my worry going into this was that people probably weren't going to be committing suicide, right during the lockdowns, right as we were in the midst of everything, because, something like a survival mechanism kicks on, and they're really just trying to survive till the next day. My worry was what happens once the lockdowns are over, once we're back to a quote, semi-normal society. What happens then when people are left with all of this loss, all of this unprocessed loss? Because really none of us have processed it. None of us have processed grief. And again, even if you haven't lost a person in your life, you went through some kind of major loss, whether it was loss of time to socialize, be with friends and family, loss of relationships, loss of jobs, loss of identities. And so all of these things converging, now that we're quote back to normal, I think we're going to see suicides and deaths of despair really skyrocket. We're seeing gun deaths skyrocket. We're seeing violent crimes skyrocket. And again, I think the fact that we haven't actually dealt with this, we haven't processed the loss, we haven't processed the trauma. We're seeing all these new neurological studies really connecting, the mind and the body. And so you put that together with the fact that we are going to have a nation full of people that have some sort of long-term disability because of COVID, and we don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. That is a huge problem. It's going to become a problem of crisis proportions in the next few years, because we literally don't have universal healthcare. We don't have a way to deal with people. We don't have a service-based economy. And so we really need to start addressing those questions right now.
I think it's also, to your point, Dr. Merritt, exposing, for example, in the conversation about education, we're seeing on university campuses, but certainly our K-12 colleagues, K-12 educators, talking about this now, the COVID gaps. And that all came from the absence of the social emotional component that went along with education. That might, what do we know long-term? How's that going to impact communities and how people engage with one another, so on and so forth. Mr. Moore, that's been a big part of the way that you've approached healthcare in the Twin Cities, is a community response. The argument being that communities suffer trauma, and so therefore, if you're not thinking holistically about a community response to that, then you in some sense make more vulnerable the people that you're trying to help. As we kind of continue with Dr. Merritt's theme around deaths of despair, how important is it to think about this in terms of community healthcare?
Yeah, I think that I want to reference again the current zeitgeist, right? The spirit of our times. I think our country so celebrates its individuality and ability for one community to thrive and others to fail. That's just not going to work in the way to really lift up all of our communities across our country in a very desperate time period. We already had gaps in care and huge social gaps in healthcare present prior to COVID. COVID just exacerbated and put a new lens and dilated our eyes to it. We now need, and in COVID was the first time I've seen in my 20+ year career in healthcare, when the healthcare systems, public systems, private systems, everyone came together and said, we got to solve this problem because we want to open the economy back up. We want to get back to a normal, some degree of normalcy. What we need in this new COVID, this new zeitgeist, to really get after these deaths, these cycles and deaths of despair is an ecosystem approach to how we bridge now, not just the healthcare system, but also the traditional nonprofit and social systems, the public sector, the counties and public sector key players, in addition to private sector around communities, to work more intentionally and more dynamically to improve the health of communities. And so whether it be partnerships with our great companies here in Minnesota like 3M and Target, hey, 3M has left some of our land here in Minnesota uninhabitable, right? What are you gonna do to help cure that? How do we partner with the public sector and bonds in order to reinvest in communities in new and innovative ways so that those communities with the less wealth get some of the most investment, right? How do we think about healthcare and funding it so everyone has access to this really basic level of care across our country? And we have health centers that are carpeted across our country that need reinvestment. We have a workforce that's decaying. We have various, we had a pandemic, but we had a whole bunch of epidemics, whether it be the opioid crisis, crack cocaine. It was a part of that crisis that folks don't like to think about that started in the 80s that is still hurting our communities. But how do we wrap around our communities as a new form of a safety net, a social safety net, an ecosystem to think about this in a different way? We have to. And I think the country's recognizing that we're in the desperate times because now this healthcare disparity stuff is impacting everybody. Rural, urban, the rich and poor, everyone's being hit, and the pandemic really brought a new light into that.
Dr. Horn, for you, when you hear a conversation around an ecosystem of care, in your experience, what has that looked like? And then kind of a secondary part of that question, as you think about this in terms of specifically diversity, equity, and inclusion work, what needs to be done within systems to prepare for that evolution of care to the degree that Mr. Moore is talking about?
So I just want to frame it as an intensivist. The sort of the physician of last resort, and that's not the best physician to contribute to the ecosystem, right? Because again, you don't want to reach out and interact with people and make connections under stress, under duress, under crises. But could you just repeat the second part of your question again?
I'm curious, you're in a very important role right now.
Yeah.
And I think a role where there's tremendous amount of stress on systems to deal with the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you are sitting, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is a big part of my work. And I've seen individuals who are quite, saying quite frankly, this is a lot.
Yeah.
I wonder how you frame that work in light of what Mr. Moore is talking about as we think about evolving healthcare in the community.
Put me on the spot. I referenced before having more people in the healthcare professions who are people of color, right? That's going to contribute to the ecosystem, not only in terms of communication, making connections, but coming from the communities that we want to reach out to. I think we can learn from practices around health equity research, including centering, finding out what communities need, centering on people that were harmed, and taking that approach. And I think, it's interesting. I talked to a really fantastic healthcare researcher here at the UW, and she was engaged in healthcare research prior to George Floyd and prior to the pandemic. But through those processes, she stopped, dancing around the term and calling it what it was, which is racism, and becoming and promoting that as underlying so many of our ills with healthcare. If we can embrace those lessons without pushback, without going backwards, I think we'll end up in a better place. But there's big ifs there, and people like Linda Villarosa, her book talking about that it's not just social determinants of health. It's not just the fact that you are Latinx and living in crowded housing. It's the effects of racism itself. It's the effects of living with micro and macroaggressions on a daily basis that take a toll on our health.
I appreciate in particular your reference to that book, Dr. Horn, because in Afterlife, a lot of the essays touch on that. There's a great piece by Eula Taylor talking about the loss of her Starbucks table, which people might look at that in a superficial way, but she's really talking about the loss of community. What happens when not only your routine is uninterrupted, but the people that you draw strength from and whom you're in community with. Robert Tsai's essay I mentioned earlier, which I think everybody should read, Somewhere USA, gets at this to a certain extent in terms of, and I talk about it in my own piece, it's also a piece of Keri Leigh's essay, epigenetic harm. The idea that, I know psychiatrists and neuroscientists have debated the question of whether intensive traumas in history can have an afterlife in terms of how they express themselves on people's healthcare beyond the event itself. And we think about someone like George Floyd's daughter saying, my father changed the world, but long-term, what will be the impact on her health? Not just in terms of the loss of a parent, but in terms of, the physical manifestations on her body, literally, from the stress that goes along with that. My colleague Michael and I published a book on Jackie Robinson this year called Call Him Jack. Jack died in his 50s of heart disease, and basically had a massive heart attack. His wife, Rachel, says consistently, racism killed my husband. People don't understand. They saw this healthy man go out and take the field. They didn't understand that he bore the weight of the nation's racial debt on his shoulders for so many years, every time he took the field. And that contributed to what she called his untimely death. It wasn't just complication from diabetes. It was the macroaggressions in his case, the microaggressions that you were talking about as well. I open that up to the panel, to everyone to weigh in on this, but specifically Dr. Merritt and Professor Tsai, I'd like to lead with you. What about this question of epigenetics? When we talk about this in terms of history and the large impact of history, what should we be emphasizing here? What should we be encouraging people to think about in terms of how we process that aspect of this?
Well, I think that, that is what we're really going to have to grapple with in the coming years, is how do we come together, especially you think of what led up to the pandemic, right? All of those years of this white supremacy, this white rage that had been unleashed with Trump taking the presidency. The fact that when this virus started, it was called that he was calling it the China virus, the acts of aggression against Asian people, Asian Americans, all of this hatred and xenophobia that was basically reawakened, and much of it in kind of a backlash to the first Black president, of course, Barack Obama, but also, the time was ripe, I think, in a lot of ways. A lot of white people in society don't know their place anymore. They don't have jobs, they don't have careers, they don't have an identity, and they're feeling lost. And of course, what's happened with the pandemic, unfortunately, is it is further isolated people. And so that's what really, as somebody who studies whiteness and white culture, that worries me more than anything, is that people have been, all of these people who have any sort of grievances have been alone in their houses for years. They feel like they have lost more. And what's going to happen when a demagogue comes along who is actually competent?
Professor Tsai, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Keri Leigh Merritt talked about earlier. During the pandemic, everybody was sort of locked in their own homes, reflecting deeply on different aspects of their lives. And sometimes one can get the sense that you're thinking about the same things. And there are certain similarities in terms of themes and reflections in our two essays, for example. The project caused both of us, I think, to think about these precarious lives that others have led, including, to some extent, people in our own families. Now, my take on this was that during the last few years, I was reminded of all the people I grew up with in the Pacific Northwest, and when I did that, I was struck by how many people, for example, I had grown up with in the small town in Washington State that I've lost track of, but in fact, either didn't make it out of their 30s or 40s, and then I asked myself, well, why not? And there was drug abuse, alcohol abuse, car accidents, suicides. When I added all that up, then it caused me to think harder about some of these themes that we've been talking about, right? What is it about these fault lines, particularly in terms of economic opportunities? This is one thing about growing up in a small town is you grow up thinking the world is your oyster, and then there's a rude awakening someday, particularly if you can't get out, and there's no jobs for you. A similar but very different thing happens if you grow up in an urban setting. But that harsh reality that sets in, it causes people to react in different ways, and sometimes they end up lashing out, and other times they end up fading away and turning to alcohol and drugs and suicide. So I think we both ended up going in that direction in our reflections about some of these existing fault lines well before COVID came along. And I guess what I would say is I would just sort of, in terms of the lessons, the questions that you asked, I would invite reflection on some of the institutions where these disparities have really wreaked havoc, and there hasn't been, at least I think, the same level of attention, and that is with policing. This is something that you, Dr. Williams, pointed out in your earliest remarks, and that the way that we police in this country varies greatly. So, right, the over-policing that people talk about that is covered in the news these days happens almost exclusively in the urban areas. The people in the rural areas don't understand what everyone is talking about, although they are affected by, right, the political discourse around it. And the suburban areas are not policed in that way either. And our policing strategies and our pre-trial detention practices, in which, I just was working on something for a piece I'm working on. If Louisiana, if the state of Georgia were countries, right, they would lead the world in terms of the rate of incarceration, and they're not the only ones. There are a number of states that would be way out as outliers, but it all has to do with the policing. It has to do with pretrial detention practices, and these were going on well before COVID. But then when COVID strikes, right, these are the populations that are the most vulnerable and are being picked off by the pandemic. There were some efforts to try to gain early release for people, particularly if they've been in prison for a long time and elderly, and of course unlikely to recidivate, right, commit some kind of crime once they're left out. But there hasn't been, at least I think, full capitalization of the moment to really take a hard look at some of the other things that have left so many people behind bars. And of course, that is a legacy of these other things that we've been talking about.
It is that long shadow, Professor Tsai, and I appreciate the way that you wove those together, because I think part of the challenge is that we think about, for example, Black Lives Matter. I'll mention two women who often come up in the conversation about the over-policed, underprotected nature of policing in this country, Raynette Turner and Sandra Bland, both who died in the custody of police, both of whom were picked up on, minor charges and ultimately suffered the fate of death by virtue of encounters with our policing system. And you speaking to that speaks to the invisibility of that element of what's wrong. Heather Ann Thompson in our volume has a piece entitled The Permeability of Cells, Mass Incarceration and COVID, where she literally talks about how COVID exposed exactly what you're describing, I think in a way that's difficult for people to ignore, that our prisons are literally, and detention centers are full of people who are serving. And someone has a question for us that kind of speaks to this, revenue generating offenses. These are not major offenses, and literally COVID meant they were facing death or grave illness by virtue of a system that can't do better to think about how to deal with these types of infractions. Not everyone that's in prison is there for the horrific crimes that our former president made a point of on the campaign trail, talking about in great detail and leading people to believe that we're a nation awash in one type of violence, when the stark reality is that our prisons and detention centers are made up of people who would, I think most people would be surprised to discover are not there for violent offenses, but for things that require treatment or other interventions that speak to the despair and precarity that we talked about earlier. I'm going to turn to the chat now and take some questions from people, and we have a few here. But I did want to say, one of the things that I appreciated about Professor Merritt's piece in particular, she begins this incredible chapter by talking about how deaths of despair have plagued her dreams. And I think there's a really powerful way for us to think in the ways in which, in a different metaphor, COVID, the long 2020, the racial reckoning, and January 6th will plague our American dream. In the sense that as we think about moving forward, and I have a problem with that because I think part of the problem, part of the challenge with the US is that Americans always want a tragedy with a happy ending. We want everything to be wrapped up in 30-minute sitcom style, and we want to walk away and chuckle and say, we got a Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Voting Rights Act of 1965, or a 19th Amendment, and then everything was done. And it's messy and it's complicated, and those shadows matter. And they matter in ways that I know, Professor Yoon, Dr. Yoon, I didn't get a chance to ask you this, but you know the complexity of this. You lead a department of 3,000 staff, and you're trying to tackle the issue of DE&I. And so that requires a deep investment. That's a lot to ask, and yet we all have to be committed to that because our goal is John Lewis's goal, to redeem the soul of America, and that's difficult work. So I'm going to turn to the chat. I will conclude by saying that one of the things that Keri Leigh Merritt and I actually titled our joint essay together was Stress Test. And I like sharing with people that the reason we settled on that is that, you never get a stress test as part of a routine physical. That always comes because you're having, some kind of, I know this intimately because I've had 4 cardiac ablations, 3 in the last 2 years. Whenever they're giving you that, that's because there's something that they're testing for. In some sense, COVID, the racial reckoning, January 6th have been a stress test for our nation. The question is, how do we respond? Not simply how we get to the end of it, but really how we think about, in the ways that Professor Tsai complicated this. COVID and choice is also intimately tied to Roe v. Wade, is also intimately tied to politics and our political situation. And dealing with that in all of its messiness in the way that so many people on this call are doing today that I think are important. I am going to take the first question here, which is, I don't see the efforts to equalize healthcare of the rich versus the poor, white versus people of color, urban versus rural, until we remove corporate profit from healthcare and institute universal healthcare in our country. Can the panel speak to this? And I'll open that up to anyone.
I'll take a stab at that, and I want to key in on one of the analogies you drew to was the Shakespearean social tragedy. Right, we're expecting to come out of this and with an American idealism that this myth of America is always going to end up perfect. We're going to solve it. But we're talking about the body politic, right? And the political determinants of health governed by our corporate capitalist institutions, right? And how that plays into the health and how we see into the body of human beings, right, in our country, and that clinical and that body autonomy that we all are looking to really be able to address and find our best path to the best health outcomes. So what do we need to change? It's clearly evident that healthcare, the access of healthcare services is a public utility. It's clearly evident. But how do you justify that in a capitalist system, right? Where many of us are rewarded for our great talents in healthcare, right? And we should be rewarded. But how do you do that equally in a country that's defined by its classism, right? By its hegemony system, historical hegemony system, right? That is built on racial lines. How do you define that? We do need a reimagination of our system. And I think the political determines itself. The political will has to reach a tragic level, right? Before we will finally examine this juxtaposition between the good for all, and every human being in our country, and the body politic, which is always governed in our institutions.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Moore.
I'll jump in briefly. I do think that our conversations about healthcare, is it a privilege? Is it a right? Is it something that where we value a choice and the possibility of excellent healthcare as opposed to covering as many people in need as possible. These have always been the challenges, and not getting to some better consensus has always been what has kept us from something closer to universal healthcare, right? Even though Harry Truman, 1945 or so, right, was the one who first proposed national healthcare plan, right? It is, in fact, Barack Obama who's the one who was successful in taking the greatest risks as president in his first term, staking his entire presidency virtually on the universal coverage aspect of it. But as we see, we still haven't reached the kind of consensus that we need to in order to make the coverage part last. And so I do think we have a lot of work to be done. I think the pandemic has revealed that the weaknesses of how a lot of us get our healthcare, which is through employment. And in the middle of a pandemic, when jobs suddenly disappear by the millions, and then your healthcare coverage then disappears by the millions, and then the medicine one needs, right, if one gets gravely ill, suddenly comes out of reach, or you have to stay in the hospital for a few days, adds up very, very quickly, potentially bankrupting people. I hope that our advocates, the people who are working on the issue, will be able to keep this as front and center as possible, so that conversation can continue.
I'll just take that one step farther and say that it's not just money out of healthcare, it's actually taking money out of politics, period. I think we need to take it that far and align ourselves with so many of the other developed nations in this world who have publicly funded elections, that they don't have all of these competing interests buying off politicians. Again, the fact that we are one of the richest nations in the world, one of the richest nations in the history of this world, and we don't have universal healthcare, especially after the deadliest pandemic in our history, is an absolute moral travesty. And it's something that we as Americans need to be out in the streets protesting and fighting for every single day. Because again, if we don't have this, as we continue this path and we have more and more people disabled, more and more people unable to work, we are going to have a crisis of monumental proportions.
Dr. Horn, anything to add?
I'm staying silent because I don't have any great answers. I agree with all the speakers. Is it a right? Is it a privilege? It's a right. It's our moral responsibility. The fact that we can let our brothers and sisters suffer from illness. I mean, that's it's just embarrassing. It should be embarrassing to us as a society. So I don't have the answer, and it's easy enough for people to raise, we can't afford that. That's just a way to remain callous and not do something. So again, I unfortunately, I don't have the answers.
And Dr. Yoon, I'm going to bring you in here. Please feel free to share if you have something to share.
Happy to. I was just putting stuff in the chat. Couple of reactions. Many of you may have heard from my accent that I did not grow up here. I grew up in Europe, in Germany, where there is universal healthcare. And it's not socialized medicine, as it always gets hijacked. It just means that everybody has coverage and everybody can get care and everybody can get good care. It also doesn't mean that the care suffers. So, and it's ironic to me, coming from Germany, where major trauma to others was really part of our upbringing and what we learned, that now we need to turn to places like Germany on how things are being done in a social, equitable fashion. It looks to me like, and I feel this is a very young nation. This is a very young nation. We have not collectively said that healthcare is a right, that housing is a right, that equal access to things is a right. And it astounds me to this day how accepting we are of inequalities that seem very basic and that don't keep up with the pace of how this country has evolved otherwise. So to me, that's really where things start, is all of us, everyone, agreeing on what is a basic right, and we need to accomplish that. I will also say the other thing that seems to me like, as a very young country, and I'm glad we have a professor of law on here, is the punitive nature of approaching things. Incarceration, you get removed from this. And we working very, very strongly now with restorative justice as a tool. It's restoring folks, it's thinking about how the other side feels. It was mentioned, what is it that's hurting? How can we remove that hurt? I think we've moved further away from this, and Professor Tsai said this, thinking about buckets. On either side, if you don't understand what I'm saying, I don't want to talk to you. That's understandable and is not going to get us forward. So I feel like we really need to pivot, despite all this hurt, or maybe because of the hurt, to a more restorative lens, so we can coalesce on what is it that we need to do for all of us.
Dr. Yoon, I so love what you shared, because I think sometimes when we talk about something like trauma-informed, it's in a very kind of limited sphere. But what you're talking about is a trauma-informed model of dealing with these challenges in a way that would then provide feedback in a way that we thought about a range of issues that might literally shift our politics. And it's interesting that you mentioned the history there again, in terms of the way that we think about socialized medicine, the European experience as opposed to the American experience, the American exceptionalism that often goes along with that. In the way that, again, back to Baldwin, if we could alter the way that we're thinking about that moment, we might have some real power to push through some real change, some significant and meaningful change. So thank you for that. We had a quick question in the chat. Someone wanted to know if someone could define what a service-based economy was. I think it was much earlier in the chat. I apologize for not getting to you. Do you want to tackle that, Dr. Merritt?
Yeah, I think that was me. So again, I'm from the South. I've lived in the South my entire life, and seeing the fact that there are times that the federal government, even what it offers the rest of the people in the country, we don't get, right? Especially in regards to healthcare. And so it's my ways of trying to figure out, how do you deal with major problems in society when you don't have the help of government? And again, this goes back to every civil rights movement this country has ever had, is that you start in your own family, in your own neighborhood, in your own community, making the changes that you have the power to make. And in the South, I have thought a lot about the fact that in rural areas, we've got to return to a service-based economy. We've got to return to an economy that where people are literally spending their time taking care of other people. We're going to have an aging population. We're going to have partially disabled population. And we have all of these kids who are now behind in education in a lot of ways because of the pandemic. And so we need to return to an economy where it's people helping other people.
Great point. Professor Tsai?
I just wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Young mentioned about the punitive quality of American culture, and I think she's right that it leaks over into a lot of areas. What I want to do is just put some numbers to the punitive quality of American punishment practices. I'm working on a book that I just sent off to my publisher. Hopefully it'll see the light of day sometime next year, but it's about the earliest decades of what we now call mass incarceration. Of course, we didn't have that vocabulary in the 70s when we really started to see incarceration rates rise. I alluded to Louisiana and Georgia. I read at the top of the list of states where if they were countries, they would be outliers in the world. And what those rates are for Louisiana, for example, is Louisiana incarcerates its own at a rate of about 1,000 people per 100,000 people who live in Louisiana. Georgia's just behind that, about 950 or so people per 100,000 people who live in that state. But here's some other, just a few other facts. For most of the 20th century, the prison population, despite impressions today, hovered around 200,000 people. And it's not until the mid-70s that the number of people incarcerated behind bars goes straight up on the chart, leaps to over 1.5 million. Today, America accounts for 22% of the entire world's prisoners, even though we make up only 4% of the world's population. And just from the preface of my next book, I say the United States is unlikely to be the most crime-ridden country in the world, but for at least the last 50 years, perhaps longer, our policies have been driven by a perception that social disorder lurks around every corner. So that's what's driving the sense of punitiveness, and there's a lot that goes into that sensation. It's media coverage, it's the politics of the war on crime, which turned into the war on drugs, which turned to the war on terror. And we'll see if that morphs once again and keeps those numbers high. But we've seen some movement downward in a number of people behind bars, but it's only a little bit. It's not the decline that we really need to see.
And we always have to worry about that inevitable backlash. You know, the kind of Jacqueline Dowd Hall talked about the grief that came before the grief, but then there's also the counter revolution that comes after the revolution. The idea that you have this opportunity or this moment, and then we find ways to restore those systems. Professor Tsai, Dr. Horn, Dr. Yoon, Mr. Moore, and my partner and amazing scholar, Dr. Merritt. I want to thank all of you for joining this discussion. I wish we had another 2 hours. I know people will often ask us, there's no hope. Can we take hope? I'll end before I turn it back over to Sam with what Dr. Merritt and I write about in the conclusion to the book in our final essay, Stress Test. And what we talk about is John Lewis, and I share this with you. If anyone should have had no hope in 2020, it was Congressman John Lewis. And I say that because he's born in the 1940s in a world in which democracy is the norm, in which segregation is the norm. He spills blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 for voting rights, and then is the first person to come out in 2013 after the US Supreme Court eviscerates sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in Shelby County versus Holder, and, you know, dies in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement. And yet, even as he's suffering and about to take his last breath, he spends that time penning a letter to the American people entitled, "Together We Can Redeem the Soul of America." And he articulates in that what we like to call the Lewis Doctrine. I want to share that with you very briefly as we go out. But Lewis writes, and this is central to Common Power's mission as well, ordinary people with extraordinary vision. When I listen to Dr. Horn, when I listen to Mr. Moore and have the privilege of working with Mr. Moore, when I have the privilege of listening to Robert Tsai or to Keri Leigh Merritt, I hear ordinary people with extraordinary vision, and that's important. And he says, we can redeem the soul of America by getting in. Everybody likes to quote the good trouble, the necessary trouble, but he's very specific. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it, but because it cannot be guaranteed, you can lose it. He also says something very important, and this is the cornerstone of our book. You must also study and learn the lessons of history, because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. And to Dr. Yoon's point, it can't just be American history. It has to be global. We have to kind of look at it from that standpoint. And so the key points of this are that ordinary people make history both individually and collectively. This panel and the work that you're doing at the University of Washington is part of making history. That's why we wanted to engage that. We need to study history not simply to understand the past, but as a conduit for navigating the present. And Dr. Yoon, you used a very powerful word that Mr. Moore used as well, imagining or reimagining our future, which is really powerful. Studying the past is one way we can develop extraordinary vision. This notion that both Professor Tsai and Dr. Merritt spoke to, struggle is constant and inevitable. But the lessons of the past can help us respond. And last but not least, and thank you, Dr. Yoon, for making this point, we must develop a global perspective that begins with our shared humanity, and that is anchored in our understanding of history. I think if more of us could adopt that Lewis doctrine, we'd be in a better place to think about not only how to tackle the social determinants of health, but to restore the very foundations of our democratic process. I will turn this over to Sean Greenlee. Sean, thank you so much for having us this evening.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I mean, I'm sure I echo the sentiment of everyone who has had the pleasure of being in attendance tonight. And thank you for the robust and thoughtful conversation today. I just do want to bring light, as Dr. Yoon indicated in chat earlier, people have lost the ability to dialogue and build bridges. So in these times, I mean, it's evident that we must come together and engage in the dialogue and identify solutions. Mr. Moore even said himself, we must develop, an ecosystem approach to support and wrap our arms around the communities. We must learn from the past and embrace the lessons that we face. It's like we're all here and we continue to encourage this ongoing learning. And in case you didn't see in chat, Dr. Scott stated, this is why it's so, so much is hinged upon voting. We have power to put people in political positions who will lobby and expand healthcare and universal healthcare. And to Dr. Merritt's point, we must, rally to push for those measures. I sincerely thank, the Institute of Common Purpose and the Department of Medicine for supporting this framework. We will continue to hold our quarterly Diversity Council lecture series, so stand by. But in the interim, in the meanwhile, please visit our respective websites for additional resources, including the Common Power foundational courses that Dr. Scott spoke about early on. Thank you, and until we meet again.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to our esteemed panelists very much. This was incredible.